Okay, national and international trends. The very first thing I did want to mention, however, the jobs and skills, the report came out 18th of November, so it's only about 6 days ago. So I expect everyone in the room to have read it thoroughly. I'm sure some have, but I really just wanted to pull one little thread out. In Pillar 4, it talks about optimising pathways and systems architecture, and it talks about harmonising Australia's tertiary education system, very much looking at how do the different sectors work together, implementing a national skills taxonomy, which I think we've already heard, and strengthening pathways like VET. And they talked about, in the tertiary harmonisation in particular, what is really interesting is they said there are a number of examples that have just arisen organically. There's been pilots and trials, but this is despite known barriers in the system. So we now have official recognition that they know there are problems with regulation, with funding and finance. There's problem with legislation and regulatory settings. There's lack of qualifications frameworks or conflicting qualifications frameworks, and we've got curriculum and pedagogy. And they've actually called out that what we're doing at the moment across industry and all these bespoke examples, it's not going to scale unless something happens to change some of these. And for me, I found that really heartening in the sense it hasn't addressed them yet, but at least now it's on the table as an acknowledged problem that we're not going to get to where we want to without some fundamental systemic change, not just in individual institutions, but across the board. But I then wanted to move on to some highlights from EPIC. And EPIC is a conference on open recognition. And Margo's going to tell us a little bit more about open recognition in a moment. But I wanted to share a couple of examples. And one of the things that I found here, a real focus on lifelong learning, learner agency, a convergence of a number of different movements of skills recognition, of RPL, of micro-credentials, of digital credentials, and sort of the underlying thread that held them all together is we're trying to recognise what people are capable of in a whole range of different formats, some of it formal recognition, some of it informal recognition, a global focus on frameworks and models that link learning and skills. So again, skills-based hiring, how do we link what we do from a learning point into it? All learning matters. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It matters. How can we verify it? How do we recognize it? And we haven't mentioned it yet much, AI, the exponential growth of AI. But what was really interesting were the case studies that were actually starting to show where AI could be usefully and thoughtfully applied. So just whipping through one, I really liked, this is from Matt Cornack, who's the head of online learning at Leeds University. And for me, it was really simple. He talks about formal education is mainly defined by the educator, but lifelong learning journeys are defined by the learner. And I think, Adam, that's something that your students are really learning. It's not something that the school or that the institution imposes. It's what learning is relevant for me. And I think when we talk about lifelong learning, we still think about it from the institution's point of view and, how do I make them a lifelong learner of my institution? The shorter answer is you don't. They're a lifelong learner. How do you make it easy for them to come? And I think there was a comment before about repeatability or a return customer. And it's not just returning to you, but it's returning to, I love that, returning to education. I bring up the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework. And the reason for that is they had a case study where they had linked the Scottish credit and Scottish. I've talked too much today. The SCQF, and they have a tool that allows you to level it to job roles to give an indication of the skills and knowledge that a person might require to do that job. And so actually looking at it and saying, do I need someone with a bachelor's, or could someone at a school leaver, or what level do they need? And we've put the link in there. You can actually go and get their employer leveling tool. They've got a whole range of resources where they have quite specifically said this is how employers can interact with and use the qualifications. So really, really nice resources.
It's way too sensible, really.
It was very sensible.
Way too sensible.
It was really sensible and straightforward. And you think, wow, how long did it take for them to make it that simple? So very impressive. We also had a look at this. This is done by an English group, Open Co-op, Doug Belshaw and Laura Hilliger, and they put out this skills mapper. And if you have a ChatGPT account, you can use this. And it basically just has a conversation with you about what your skills are, what people say about you, and then it maps it to the, sorry, I've got me in the way or us in the way on this. It maps it to ESCO, ONET, and the OECD Skills for Jobs database. So I told it what I did, and it came back with all these really, really, mapping against these frameworks that I could actually say, hey, this is what I can do. And it matches it to rich skills descriptors if you ask it to do that. And it will even then suggest possible careers and possible jobs. It's a beta and it is open GPT, so don't put your most sensitive information into it. But by all means, have a play, because it's a really good example of how you might help individuals to understand their own capability and what they can do.
So when higher education collapses, then we'll all go on to this and find out how to career.
Pretty much, yeah, why not? I've been, I actually put something that was relatively close to me in, and then I made up a person, and I thought that actually probably matches the person I made up. And I know different people have tried it, putting in their kids' profiles and saying what they do. So it's really quite good fun to
Therein
use.
lies the issue, though, right? None of that's verified, none of it's validated. Yeah, I could be an astronaut and it would tell me all the wonderful career things I can do as an astronaut. I'm not discounting that as a valid form of, I'm self-asserting, but there is evidence that we need to provide. There's proof.
So it's actually really good for like con men.
Yeah.
So anyway, please don't use it for nefarious reasons. And over to you.
I want to talk to you about EPIC. So it's my second time at EPIC as a physical attendee. I've been virtually before because it was during COVID. But it's really one of those conferences that opens up your eyes that we are all attacking the same problem, but we're really coming at it from a different lens of perception. And whilst we were in Paris, we signed the Paris Declaration. And the Paris Declaration is, as it says there, I don't need to read it through for you. You can probably Google it and go online. The highlights being that recognition is a fundamental human practice, that everyone has the power to recognise. The act of recognition is potentially emancipatory. That trust is intrinsic to recognition. Recognition is an ethic. And that the act of recognising is a social act. And I think actually we've discussed a lot of that here today around that notion that perhaps communities are the ones that, can enact recognition, and that recognition has an individual and collective impact. And those are all pretty powerful statements. And as you can probably imagine, coming together from a very, very global community around this was just such a joyous experience. And so if you ever have the opportunity, and we are cooking up an EPIC in Australia as well, so stay tuned. So I just wanted to basically make you aware of it more than anything else. It kind of flies under the radar a little bit, but I think it's a really important thing to bring to the surface. Which one button am I pressing?
So the mouse button, yep.
Thank you. This was a recurring theme, right? We actually don't have a skills gap, or we do. There are jobs without people and people without jobs. We know that. But actually, more importantly, I think we have a recognition issue. And that's really, if we're focusing our collective good to fix something, that might be a good focus point, right? We've all spoken around it in this wonderful afternoon of conversation, but as I said to this table here, I think we've spoken a lot about teaching and learning. I want it to be teaching and learning and recognition, right? That's the three that we need to be focusing on. I went to a couple of conferences. One was in Paris, one was the Open Recognition one. The other one was a competency-based education conference in Colorado Springs. That means nothing here. It was more just, I felt like I was a little bit outside of myself looking into this conference. It was a large conference. There was 800 people. That's grown exponentially since, its origins. Competency-based education to the US is this new amazing thing. It's amazing, which is a little, difficult for us to reconcile, because we've had this rich history in Australia of decades of competency-based education in the vocational sector, but for them it's a real fight against bums on seats and the Carnegie unit and the way that their whole world is constructed around that notion of learning. So they're really fighting against a very entrenched system, and you can't, the passion that they've got to really change and break open that system is really to be applauded. A couple of things struck me though, that there's not really the recognition that fundamentally technology has to be in service of human goals and potential, right? That it's not to be something that's feared, it's not to be something that, is an us and them that is separate, that fundamentally technology, and that includes AI, really has to be in service of, those very human goals. There was a lot of talk there around technology from a scale and sustainability perspective. And I would go further to say the talk was around productivity and efficiency, right? Coming from that very institutional view that when we employ technology, it's only for those purposes. And I guess I would posit that we have the flipped coin, right? That when we look at technology, yes, we have to look at it from a productivity and efficiency perspective, from an institutional or even a system-wide perspective. We also have to look at it from a learner perspective. And that's a very, very different view. It doesn't mean that analytics are not important from an institutional perspective, but you have to flip that to say that, do the learners also have that same, view into those metrics? And it plays into the notion that we've been speaking about all afternoon, which is around agency. Once you imbue that knowledge and visibility with the learner, then they can make the informed decisions around pathways. So, yeah. The other point in the conversations as well was around, guess what? It's complex. Why we're all having trouble is because it's complex. And not only are we looking to move a skills first ecosystem, forward, it's not just it's not just a one system, right? It's a complex adaptive system that is embedded with multiple complex adaptive systems, education systems, employment systems, social justice systems. Like, it is a multifaceted, difficult place to be, and we are finding ourselves very firmly right now in the messy middle. That is a term courtesy of Ms. Palmer here, and I love it, because the messy middle is, a place we've got to get comfortable with, because it's not going to change. This has always been this way. What we have to do is think around, what can we do really that makes us design intentionally for human potential? And when we're deciding on that design for human potential, what does that look like for scale and sustainability from a technology perspective too? What is the plumbing we're going to put in place to make sure that all moves forward? And I think it's a disconnect at the moment. I think that, technology has always been something that has been put upon us, that it's sort of external to what we're doing, that it's an afterthought. That can no longer be the case. If we are really going to do all the things that we magically want to do collectively and I guess separately within our institutions, you have to have that intentional design from a technology perspective. So I think that was an important an important articulation from my perspective. So one more thing just around complex systems is that another observation that I will make is that complex systems have to be modeled at all levels. They have to be modeled at the micro level, the individual. They've got to be modeled at the meso level, which is usually the institution or the organization. They definitely have to be modeled at the macro level, which is our political landscape. And there's also that meta level too, which is all the stuff that we faced through COVID, those unknowns, those big forces, those technological forces. We, I think, have been very stuck in the meso level. There's been some attempt at the macro level from a political perspective to start modelling, but not much. We tend to model from the meso level, and we've really got to start thinking at all of those levels if we're really, really going to affect any kind of change too. So I will hand over to Wendy.
And thank you, Margo. And I will stress that the open recognition movement really is something to look at, because it really is so aligned with what we're trying to do. And so we wanted to bring it to people's attention. I wanted to wrap this up by, again, I think some of you will have seen this before because it is something that I go on about a lot. But when we talk about micro-credentials and evidence and recognition, we often tend to conflate micro-credentials and digital credentials, and they're actually quite different things. So, and when we talk about digital credentials and credentialing, that in itself is a way for career seekers to demonstrate skills, for hiring managers to understand what they have. And it doesn't necessarily need to be inferred by an educational institution, by other things. So this idea of digital credentials, and one of the reasons that this is so complex is credentialing itself is undergoing a massive disruption. We're now seeing things like government documents, health records, employment records, all of that going online and becoming digital records. I just recently moved from Victoria to Queensland, and I still haven't managed to set up my Queensland MyGov identity because apparently it's different to my Victorian MyGov identity. And I'm like, wow, I just did not expect that. So I still don't have my driver's license online. So there's also that disruption as well. But if we want to position it as to what we're looking at is if a digital credential is evidence, verifiable evidence of something, then often when we talk about a micro-credential, it's evidence of some form of learning. And I think it's an important definition because when we talk about credentialing systems, we're not necessarily talking about micro-credentialing systems, we're talking about digital credentialing. And I think it's important to call it out because the technology is subtly different and it's part of the plumbing. And if we look at the digital credential ecosystem, so this is a concept I came across at the Digital Credential Summit, again, a summit that's held annually in America. They were starting to look at this idea of what's in the ecosystem. And if we look at the left-hand side, the organisational issuers, I mean, higher ed have been issuing credentials for years. We've got licensing professional associations. So the actual making micro-credentials is quite mature. Even the credentialing issuing is relatively mature, you know, Credly, Badger, you know, you can think of any number of them. Those platforms have been around for quite a while. They're known. People quite confidently get a badge and share it on LinkedIn. Credential portability, this is where we're getting a bit more into emerging systems. You know, how do I, you know, lots of people want to make their own wallets. And I was talking with someone, it'd be like going into Woolworths and they say, here's our rewards card and here's our Woolworths wallet, you can put it in. And someone else going, here's your Coles wallet. I don't mind you having the cards, but I want my own wallet. And so things like the portability, the verification, you know, if I walk into Coles and I don't have my Coles wallet, how do they know that my Coles credential is actually real? And I know that's really simplistic, but it's that idea of the technical standards that underpins it and the portability, that's only just starting to emerge. And then this one's been really fascinating to watch. It's the consumption of credentials. And, you know, we issue a credential and then we think, well, what's actually going to use it? And so it's these emerging HR and talent marketplaces, which are driven by AI, which actually where you don't put a job in as an old traditional position description, you list it as a skills or a skills-based job, and then the AI goes and looks for people with relevant skills. That really, really enables skills to be transferable because you're no longer looking at just, here's a job title, and I'm going to work, you know, I'm going to go to Seek and I'm going to look up anything that has learning designer in it. It could, you know, that, so you're starting to see that, but these are still, they're very much emerging. They're patchy. I know Seek and LinkedIn are both sort of working on models of that. And again, but it's going to get legs when it's got this verification and standards underneath it. And I have been watching with interest as employers start to use AI for recruitment and employees or candidates start to use AI to write their cover letters. We basically have AI looking at AI and it hasn't really helped. But what could help is if you actually had verifiable credentials sitting underneath it that, as Margo said, actually provide that evidence. And so the final thing is there are standards out there, both around open recognition and open badging standards. I am completely platform agnostic, but I do say ask your providers what standards they're using. If you're going to do something, think about the data architecture and what it does. And there endeth my rant on data and standards.
I would like to just add one more thing, looping back to that's still a design for scale and sustainability, but not for the learner.
Yeah.
Right. So we still have a lot of work to do to keep looping it back to that micro level, because even though they say they're designing for the learner, I don't think any learners designed that. Right. So it's I think it's just we've got to keep reminding ourselves, right, who we're designing for.